Good morning, everyone. I'm just going to give it a minute or so, just a few more seconds to let people join the session. Just to sort of run through a bit of an intro. We're here today at Bristol Technology Festival. Thank you very much indeed to the Bristol Tech Fest team for having us on board today. We've got an interesting talk lined up for you. Get Rich Quick is the title of the talk, and going to take a few minutes, just a few, steal a few minutes of your time just to introduce myself and Geovation. So my name is Luke Hampson. I'm the Partnership and Outreach Manager for Geovation. And there are my contact details there at the bottom of that slide you're seeing. It's my Twitter handle, Luke733, and my email address, luke.hampson@geovation.uk. In case you want to reach out, ask me any questions whatsoever about the talk or about Geovation. So if I start just some intro slides before handing you over to the main event and my colleague Paul Nebel, who's going to run the talk. Let's go to the next slide. So Geovation is an Ordnance survey initiative, and we've been in existence for 10 years now, actually. So, skipping ahead there. We consist of a community network, an accelerator. We run a fully funded accelerator program where we take companies through that program and give them funding to help them start up. We also have a hub that's based in London, so a physical space in central London, not open at the moment, but hopefully will be in the not too distant future again. And we have a partner hub network as well, which I'm going to cover a bit more on a slide after this. We support startups in the geospatial and property sectors currently. It's in association with HM Land Registry for England and Wales and the Registry of Scotland north of the border. And we're around a team of 15 or so, and it's a multidisciplinary team that's consisting of kind of a business team and a technical team. So over the 10 years, we've given £2 million worth of grants away and to around 125 companies in the location and prop tech arena. 79% of those companies are still active, so the methodologies we use seems to be working quite well. They're still active and in existence. Those companies have raised £86 million in additional funding since we've supported them, and it's a really broad portfolio of companies we support because geography, it touches anything. Anything happens somewhere. We have a really broad bunch of companies that are part of our accelerator program and wider community. So Geovation wouldn't be a success like it is without its kind of sponsors and partners. I've mentioned HM Land Registry and Registers of Scotland there. Of course, we have a bunch of partners either paying a little bit of a financial contribution or in-kind support as well. So you see some of the logos there, such as DSTL, British Geological Survey, and IBM, as well as others. It works so well because we work with other partner hubs, as I mentioned in the earlier slide. So you might be familiar with the Engine Shed, as they're based in Bristol. We have a network of partner hubs in Bristol, in Birmingham, in Manchester, and Cardiff currently. That might grow, but these partner hubs were able to link into those networks and essentially offer benefits to some of our members of our community that are based in the different regions throughout Britain. And some of our the partners beneath there in the ecosystem, some of our companies have gone on to graduate to the likes of Y Combinator and others. So it works best in a network of networks, and that's what we find. Very selfish quick plug. Tomorrow at 11 a.m. we're running a session on the Ordnance Survey Data Hub, and this is just a slide to tell you a bit about the Data Hub. It's a technical new sort of one-stop shop for accessing Ordnance Survey data. It's free to access up to a threshold, and we're running a session on that tomorrow at 11. So check the Bristol Tech Fest website for that if you're interested. And so that's it from me. I'm going to pass you over to Paul now, and I hope you enjoy the talk. And please do get in touch if you have any questions at all. Thanks, and over to you, Paul.
Thank you very much, Luke. So I'm just going to share my screen quickly. There we go. Now let's start the presentation. Okay. So yes, good morning, everybody. My name is Paul Nebel. I'm one of the senior engineers at Geovation. And in that context, I have a couple of roles. One is to act as a technical advisor and to help build experiments, prototypes, and occasionally products, and I'll explain why later on in the talk. But my other hat is to act as a so-called virtual CTO for those companies that are Geovation Hub members or who are on the program, the accelerator program that we run. For people who don't necessarily have their own technical director or CTO role, and also more generally to help in the creation and design of businesses. So I am actually going to switch off my camera effectively by sliding a little flap over it, because I'm standing up at the moment and I don't want to distract you by seeing me pacing up and down or stare out of the window as I'm giving the presentation. So I'll appear back on the screen at the end of this talk when the chance for questions arises. But for now, I'm going to leave you to the presentation. So the title of this talk is Get Rich Quick. And I hope that in the adverts that you saw presenting it, they contained the question mark at the end. And I hope if they did that you noticed the question mark, because the question mark is extremely significant. In truth, if you are here because you want to hear how it is that I managed to earn enough money to drive a Ferrari in 3 years through helping other companies, I'm afraid you're in the wrong place, because a better name for this talk would be how to avoid losing tens of thousands of pounds of your own money and wasting 2 years of your life. Why do I say that? Well, let's have a look at some statistics relating to startups. These statistics come from the UK government. In the 2018 to 2019 tax year, 672,890 startups were founded based on Companies House data. So that equates to 1,843.5 per day, or 76.8 per hour. So that's more than one company a minute for every minute of every day in the last tax year. Now, the good news is that 89% of the companies that were founded in 2017 survived their first year. Slightly less good news is that looking back to the statistics from 2013, 57.6% of the companies that started up in 2013 did not exist 5 years later. So that means 4 out of 10 companies survived 5 years. Now, there is another caveat to these statistics, which is to say, these relate to all startups that were created in the UK. So that includes not only innovative technology-led companies, hopefully like yourselves, but it includes plumbers, it includes carpenters, it includes nail bars. It's all startups that were created. So, in general, as a startup, you have a 1 in 4, I beg your pardon, a 4 in 10 chance of surviving for 5 years or more. That's the good news. Here's the bad news. As an innovative technology startup, there is a common figure which is bandied about, which says that 9 out of 10 innovative technology startups fail. Although interesting, very rarely do we get a timescale with that figure. However, 9 out of 10 is the rule of thumb. Unfortunately, that statistic is wrong. It's not 9 out of 10, it's 11 out of 12. It's even worse than that. And that's based on a report of 3,200 high-growth startups, in fact, it may be more by now, which is being created by a thing called the Startup Genome, which you can look up online and see their figures. So 11 out of 12 chance of surviving. The most common reason why, quoted by startups that have failed, as to why they failed, is because they did not achieve so-called product market fit. That analysis admittedly comes from a relatively smaller number of startups by a company called Failery.com, but it is also a pretty common quotation that I've seen from other places. And in my own experience, it is the number one reason why people don't succeed. Interestingly, one of the main reasons, the predominant reason, in fact, why startups perform poorly is premature scaling. So, in other words, they try to get too big way too quickly before their performance justifies it. And just to add a little bit more salt into the wound, a study done by Professor Clayton Christensen in the US showed that not just for innovation startups, but for all companies, 95% of all product innovations fail. Uh-oh. So, actually, the basis and the foundation and the intent of this talk is to give you, in effect, a whistle-stop tour of the procedures and processes that I take hub members and program members through when they join Geovation. And it has to be said, obviously, I hope, that this is nothing more than a personal opinion. Actually, it is slightly more than a personal opinion because it's an opinion that's shared by my colleagues at Geovation. But the point is, like all of these things, and any book that you read on this subject, or any blog that you follow, it is only an opinion. You're perfectly free to ignore what I say and to question what I say. But it's based on my experience helping, I'm not sure of the exact number any longer, but somewhere between 50 and 100 startups to start up. And the main problem that I come across from my point of view when talking to startups that come to me in Geovation is that they are what I would describe as solutions in search of a problem rather than problems in search of a solution. There is a joke which I'm going to decontextualize because it could be considered somewhat distasteful. It's not intended that way. So this decontextualized and therefore no longer very funny joke goes something like this. A traveler asks a local person in a country that the traveler is visiting, "How do I get to big city?" And the local person responds, "Well, if I was going to big city, I wouldn't start from here." Yeah, it's not very funny without the context, but you know, the point of it is there is a wise truth hidden in that, which is to say that if you want to get to an endpoint, you have to make sure that you're starting from the right place. And my intention in this talk is to help you understand how you get yourself to that right place. In Geovation, we have an equation. We call it the innovation equation. And it goes something like this. In fact, it goes exactly like this. Innovation equals problem times solution times execution. And this doesn't necessarily only apply to innovation, but it does particularly apply to innovation. But you could replace the word innovation, for example, with the word impact. The impact of your business on the world is the product of the problem times the solution times execution. Sometimes you will hear this described in terms of the problem being a market and the solution being a product. Be careful of the terms that you use. I'm several times going to come back to this later on in the talk, and to my mind, there's a very good reason for being careful about how you describe something, because it can make quite a big unconscious change in the way that you approach what you're trying to do. So in this case, what we're saying is the larger the problem, the greater the possibility of innovation or impact. The more of the problem that your solution addresses, again, the greater the possibility of innovation or impact. And the better your execution of that solution, again, the more chance you have of innovating and impacting in a successful way. So let's take a quick look at the components of this equation. First and foremost, and there is a reason for this, we start with the problem. If there's one thing that you take away from this talk, that I beg you to take away from this talk, it is start with the problem. Ask yourself the question, if you haven't done so already, what is the problem that you're trying to solve? It's the single most important thing that you can do. The next question that follows immediately on the heels of that is, who does it affect? And finally, in broad terms, why does it matter to them? And the issues that we are addressing here relate to the desirability of your business. Do they want it? Is there a market out there for what you want? And in essence, there are two ways you can approach your market, two ways you can approach the problem. Either you can make something that gives a small amount of return to a large number of people, or you can make something that creates a large amount of return for a small number of people. And it is a recognized rule of thumb, recognized by, amongst other people, Paul Graham, who's one of the co-founders of Y Combinator, that it is not necessarily the case that all successful startups are ones that provide a large amount of return to a small amount of people. Clearly, there are startups that provide a small amount of people. But by and large, those that succeed and do well fall into the latter group. A large amount of return to a small number of people. Let's suppose you have identified a problem, and that should be your starting point. Your next question is, what is my solution? And I use the word solution here very purposefully, just as in the previous slide I used the word problem very purposefully. So the reason I use the word solution here is because a typical response I get when I ask startups about the solution they're providing will be something along the lines of, oh, we're making an artificial intelligence, machine learning based app. To which my response is a blank stare, because I didn't ask you how you were doing it, I asked you what you were doing. How you were doing it is completely irrelevant to me. What I care about is what, and solution is what, not how. And it's important to focus on what you're doing rather than how you're doing, because in technological terms, I could give you pretty much an infinity of different ways of doing something with technology. But the question is not whether I can give you 15 or 100 or 1,000 different options for building something. The question is whether any of those solutions actually solve the problem that exists in a way that the people who suffer from it are prepared to pay. So rather than thinking about how you do something, think about what you do. What benefits does your solution provide? Here's an important point. How are you testing that your solution has potential? Testing is an incredibly important part of what I'm about to tell you. And finally, why is your solution better than alternatives? And it's quite important to say people are often worried about the idea of competition. And you shouldn't necessarily be worried about competition, although clearly you do need to be aware of it and you do need to account for it. But the existence of competition isn't necessarily a bad thing. For one thing, it does tell you that the problem that you're addressing is potentially significant enough for other people to have recognized it and to have entered the market. And if competition exists, your best way of dealing with it, and this hopefully seems self-evident, is to do things better than your competition. So in other words, get ahead of the game. If you're coming into this with a different point of view, and you're addressing the problem in a better way, or addressing different parts of the problem, then you have a chance to get ahead of your competition. Oh, I forgot to mention, in this context, we're interested in the feasibility of your business. In other words, can you do it? Is it possible to provide the how of your solution based on the what? Finally, we get to execution, right? Let's suppose you've identified a significant problem, and let's suppose you've come up with a solution that addresses a lot of that problem, and the solution can be built. The next question is, how are you going to make any money from it? When appropriate, not right at the beginning, when you've got too much work and too many people trying to buy your product for you to deal with, then you ask the question, how will you scale it? What is your unfair advantage for success? And this goes to the point of viability of your business. Should we do it? Does it cost us more to make a sale than the money, the return that we receive for that sale? If it does, we're doing something wrong. And problems are important. They're the point from which you start. Solutions are important because they tell you how much of a problem you can address. But arguably, once you have established those two things, the only thing that matters from this point onwards is execution. A lot of people are surprised when I say that, and they say, well, what about ideas? You know, don't we have to have good ideas? Yes, you do. But unfortunately, by and large, our ideas are worthless. I'm sure that in 5 minutes, if I had a discussion with all of the people who are watching this presentation, we could come up with 10 ideas that could save the world from catastrophe. That's kind of irrelevant, though, if we don't do anything about them or we can't do anything about them. Execution is key. You can sell a poor idea if there is a market out there that is hungry enough for a solution. I'm not suggesting that you should sell a poor idea, but what I'm saying is it can be done. Execution is one of the things that counts once you've laid the groundwork. So, given that we have 3 important components, problems, solutions, and executions, where do we go from there? Well, the starting point is to identify your market. So this is where we're looking at what are the problems, how do they exist, where do they exist? And I would recommend bearing in mind the comment that it is more likely to lead to success if you can give a large amount of satisfaction to a small number of people. This is where we talk about finding your niche. So in other words, finding that small group of people that are specific enough that you are very unlikely to have significant competition, but large enough that they present a good enough opportunity for you to generate the revenue that you need in order to be able to build your business from that single starting point. And one of the ways that you go about doing this is to put yourself in the shoes of your customer. In fact, this is, to my mind, completely essential in order to succeed with all the points that follow from here. And a way of doing that is to start with a thing that we call a customer persona or perhaps an empathy map. And if you type either of those terms into Google and do a quick image search, you'll see all sorts of pictures that look roughly like what you see on your screen at the moment. So an empathy map consists of a number of different sections. And typically those sections are saying, seeing, thinking and feeling, and hearing. There may be others, it doesn't matter really. Now the point is what you're trying to consider is all of the influences that affect the way that the customer thinks. A good starting point and a good justification for creating customer personas is to be quite detailed in how you describe that particular customer. So give them a name. Find an image on the internet that represents your internal imaginary idea of this customer. Who are they? In a business-to-business context, what do they do? In a general context, what's their job title specifically? Are they married? Do they have a family? What age are they? What kind of car do they drive? What hobbies have they got? Why do you go to this extent? Well, because the whole idea is for you to be able to comfortably slip into this persona when you're conducting the techniques that follow on from this, which I'll explain later. But that's not the only advantage. Another advantage is that if you have described your customer persona correctly and successfully, you can share it with the rest of your team. And from that point onwards, you can say, right, we're going to look at this from the point of view of Dave Bloke, or we're going to look at it from the point of view of Jane Girl. And other people on your team understand what you mean. Immediately, they can put themselves into the same thought space that you're occupying and understand where you're coming from. So in order to create the persona, we consider the things you can see on screen, what they're saying. So what's their attitude in public? What is their behavior towards others? How do they measure success? What are they seeing around them in the environment, in the newspapers, in blogs, on Twitter, on billboards? What are their friends saying? What are the offers that they're receiving? What are they thinking and feeling? What counts to them? And this is what I mean. This is what really matters to them. So what are the things that are going to make them look better with their colleagues, get them that best employee award, get them the better job next time around, or a promotion in their current job? What are their occupations and preoccupations? What are they worried about? What's blocking them? And finally, what are they hearing? What are their friends saying? What is their boss saying? What are the people they are influenced by saying? And as an example, here we go. So again, this is just a random image that I picked up off the internet for the purposes of this presentation. And this relates, it's slightly outdated because it relates to buying a video recorder. And I'm not really sure that many people buy a video recorder nowadays, but let's imagine that we're considering buying a mobile phone for doing video recording. The principle is the point. So they might be saying things like, what the hell is a codec? Because a lot of what they see includes information about video codecs. I don't care what a codec is, I just want to point the thing at something and shoot it so that I can take a nice video. What are they seeing? They're seeing a market that's saturated by video recorders or mobile phones. And there are so many out there that they can't choose, other than looking at things like codecs that they don't understand. They're really confused. What are they thinking and feeling? I just want something that works, you know, can you take some of the difficulty away from me? Just give me something that I can take videos with. I don't want an extra suitcase and a million peripherals. What are they hearing? My friend Jane said her $1,000 Sony camcorder doesn't even work with her Mac. Or Dad's still nagging me to give him a copy of the home video for last Christmas. The point about all of this is you're framing a picture in your mind of this person. And the reason for framing that picture in your mind for this person is because the next step, after creating as many customer personas as you can identify, is to go to something called a value proposition. This is what a value proposition looks like. Again, there are many templates for this that are available on the internet. And so far I've been referring to customers. And I should say that it's important to draw a distinction in your mind between customers and users. Okay, so my definition of a customer is someone who pays for the product, as opposed to a user who is someone who, strangely enough, uses the product. And particularly in a business-to-business context, those two things, the customer, the paying person, and the user, can and often will be entirely different people. So if you've got a product or service that costs more than, as a rule of thumb, £5,000, at that level of cost, chances are a decision to purchase has got to be made by a finance director, or at least someone higher up the executive chain. So under those circumstances, it's really important to consider, why as a finance director would I care about buying this thing for people in my organization who are going to use it? And the finance director's jobs, pains and gains may be related to, but quite different from, the user's jobs, pains and gains. And it's really important to understand that. because the person you have to persuade in the first instance is the finance director, for example. So I'm getting slightly ahead of myself. The value proposition is about problem-solution fit. Now, sometimes you'll hear this referred to as product-market fit, or in the way that I've described it here, market-product fit. But most typically, you'll hear product-market fit. And I mentioned earlier on that, to my mind, the terminology that you use is very important, and this is a case in point. A major problem for me with the term product-market fit, first of all, is that the product comes first in that description. The product should never come first. The most important thing is the market. And actually, it's not the market or the product. It's the problem and the solution. If you talk about a product market fit, you are immediately putting yourself into a business frame of mind. You're immediately thinking about transactions. You're immediately thinking about finance. Now, that's great. I'm not saying don't do that. What I'm saying is that that's not necessarily appropriate for this stage of thinking. And I don't believe it helps a great deal at this stage of thinking. Because if you start thinking only in the purely financial or business terms, then the potential for you to ignore and block out and not follow up a wide range of options becomes much larger. You narrow your options down if you're only thinking in business terms at this stage. So I think it's quite important to refer to this as a problem-solution fit, because you're examining exactly that, a problem that someone is suffering from that they are potentially going to pay you to relieve, and a solution which is your way of addressing that problem, what you do, not how you do it. So for the problem-solution fit, the value proposition, we start off on the left-hand side here, and you will have to create a value proposition for every customer persona that you've identified and every user persona that you've identified. Now, this is going to be a painful process. I'm not going to try and hide that and pretend that it isn't. And there are reasons why it's painful. The first reason is that it can often be quite boring. Sorry to say that, but it is. It's just quite boring to have to go through this in the level of detail that I recommend that you need to go through it in order to get the most from it. The second reason why it's quite painful is because in order to really understand your customer and your user, you're probably going to start off from the point of view of your assumptions, what you think that customer fits, what you think their persona describes. But the important point there, and we'll come to this in my next slide, is the word assumption. Okay, if there's one thing that classifies, I beg your pardon, the world of the startup, no matter what startup you are, but particularly if you are an innovative technology startup, it is the word uncertainty. You are going to have to master your fear and embrace uncertainty, because your existence at the moment is going to be defined as one of uncertainty. And everything that I'm describing to you here is the process of trying to relieve and remove as much uncertainty as you can from your world in such a way that rather than wandering around blindly in a fog, you can start to see the outline of shapes in the distance and then walk towards those shapes and get a better feeling for what they represent. I won't stretch the analogy any further than that, but I'm trying to help you achieve some sort of clarity in a world of uncertainty. So, as I say, you're going to start off with assumptions about your personas, but you're going to have to turn those assumptions into something concrete, and I'll get to how you do that in a moment. For the time being, however, we are looking at your customer, and there are three main areas that we need to look at. First one is called loosely jobs or tasks. What I mean by that is, in the context of the problem that you have identified, what does this individual do? How do they conduct their daily business? If we're talking about a business-to-business context, what are the actual tasks that they perform on a daily basis in the context of the problem that you're solving? And quite often, what people will say in this context might be something like, oh, they have to prepare a report, or they have to reconcile accounts. Those are the examples of the typical things that people say when they're describing jobs. And those are great starting points. But unfortunately, this is where the difficulty and the potential boredom comes in. They're only starting points. The description of a job, create a report, is actually of no use to you whatsoever, because it doesn't tell you anything about how they create the report. It doesn't tell you anything about the process they have to go through, the steps that are involved. And it is those steps and that process, the detail, the weeds of that, which is where your solution is going to address the pains and the gains. So simply describing things at the high level isn't going to do you much good, and it's not worthwhile. You have to go into as much detail as you possibly can. So once you've described your jobs, and by all means describe them at a high level, and then go through them, as I said, in as much detail as you can, the next thing, and you will probably find that this comes out as you are describing the jobs, is pains and gains. Oh, and by the way, I meant to say in the last slide with the personas that a good way of going about this is to get a dirty great big sheet of paper, or preferably a whiteboard, and a bunch of post-it notes and a Sharpie, and write everything down on post-it notes and stick them on the whiteboard with a piece of paper. I'm probably telling you how to suck eggs, so forgive me if I'm doing that, but just in case you weren't aware of a good way of going about doing this, that's a good way of doing it, because you can move things around in a way that suits you. So as you've described your jobs, you'll probably come up with things like typical pain that someone will describe as it takes time, or it costs them money. And I should say that there is a big difference between pains and gains. So a pain is just that. It's something that keeps someone awake at night. It's something that adds up to that sum of dissatisfaction at the end of the week that makes them want to have a stiff drink when they get home because they're so fed up with what they're doing. It's something that worries them because they have to get something done by a deadline and they don't know how to do it. Pain is exactly that. And unless you're creating luxury goods, all purchasing decisions for your products and services will be driven by the relief of a pain. Nobody ever bought Microsoft products because they look pretty. A gain is not simply the opposite of a pain. A gain is something which doesn't necessarily address the pain at all, but gives benefit in other ways. So it might be something that makes the customer feel better because it helps them achieve their promotion or helps them get a better job, but doesn't necessarily take the pain away. So I gave you a couple of examples of pains, and these are typical ones that come up. It costs too much, or it takes too long. Again, those are good starting points, but in and of themselves, they're completely useless to you. The question is not, does it cost money or does it take time? Because, of course it does. Why else is someone going to buy something from you? How else does a pain manifest itself other than ultimately in time or money? That's not the question. The question is how much time and how much money. That's the level of detail that you need to go in, and you can only do that by asking questions. And instantly, there's a useful technique that you can use here, which is to ask the question, why? And funnily enough, this technique is called the 5 whys. You may have heard of it before. It probably came from somewhere before this, but it's most famously attributed to Toyota and their production system that they developed for creating cars in the Second World War. I won't go into the history of it any more than that, other than to say that it has been found that in most people's experience that if you ask the question why of a problem, by the time you've asked why 5 times, you've generally got to the root cause. So if you're describing jobs and you can't get beyond the top level of they create a report, ask yourself, why do they create a report? Well, they create a report because they've got to provide a set of figures to someone else. Why do they have to provide a set of figures? Because they've got to justify and prove that they've reached a target. Why is it that you get the point? You can do the same thing with the pains and gains, and I recommend that you do, because, as I've said, the real value to this analysis lies in the detail of those things and not in the high level. Once you've done that, you can move on to your products and services on the right-hand side. So you start off with a description of what you do. And again, remember, the key word here is what, not how. So no artificial intelligence, no buzzwords, okay, no blockchain, no artificial intelligence, no machine learning. Those are all how. They're completely irrelevant. You could do it many, many different ways. If you are using blockchain, or you are using artificial intelligence, or you are using machine learning, what are you using it to do? So just in the way that you approached your customer, you can write down at a very high level the products or services that you're offering and the features of those products or services that might be of use in solving the problem that you've identified. And just in the way that previously with respect to the customer, describing the jobs gives rise to pains and gains, so describing your features, products and services will allow you to start categorizing those features, products and services in terms of pain relievers. So in other words, if you're, take an analogy whereby your customer has a headache, a pain reliever feature might be a paracetamol, whereas a gain creator feature might be a vitamin pill. So the paracetamol relieves the pain. A vitamin pill doesn't relieve the pain, but it makes the person feel better in other ways. Once you've written down all of your products and services and all of the features and the pain relievers and the gain creators that you're intending to provide in your solution to address the problem, you can then start drawing lines, connecting pain relievers to pains and gain creators on the right-hand side to post-its on the left-hand side. And there is a reason for doing this, which is more than just making a pretty diagram. And it is quite satisfying, actually, to create a pretty diagram when you do this. But the reason for doing it is that's going to give you a really good idea of how much of a problem you are solving. And just as importantly, those bits of a problem which you are not addressing. Why are those things important? Well, first and foremost, when you're talking to investors and customers, clarity is incredibly important. And clarity means not only telling them what you will do, but also telling them what you won't do. And with respect to customers in particular, if you tell them what you're not doing, it sounds like a negative thing, but it needn't necessarily be. Because for one thing, it avoids the issue whereby customers come back to you being very unsatisfied, saying, I thought your thing did this, but it turns out it doesn't. Well, if you told them up front, not only what it does, but what it won't do, then there's much less chance of that happening. But more importantly, from your point of view as a business, identifying those elements of the problem that your solution does not address leaves you with a couple of possibilities. First, it means that you've got a stack of things that could provide product features in the future. So things to enhance your product. Secondly, in the shorter term, if your experimentation is showing that what your current trajectory is not necessarily as viable as you hoped it would be, it gives you the potential to pivot into other areas of the problem before you have to abandon it altogether and start addressing something completely different. The end result of all of this value proposition work is not actually the jobs, pains, gains, and the products and services, pain relievers and gain creators. That's not what we're trying to get to here. Those things are a mechanism that take us to the really significant output from this process. And the really significant output from this process is assumptions. In drawing up this value proposition, what implicit and explicit assumptions have you made in all of the statements that you've put down on this piece of paper or on this whiteboard? The reason that the assumptions are important goes back to what I said previously, that you exist in a world that is defined by uncertainty. If you can start identifying the assumptions you've made on which the success of your business rests, you've got a much better chance of being able to create hypotheses that can lead to experiments that test those assumptions. And testing is the single most important thing that you can do. Test frequently, test often, test cheaply. Embrace failure. Failure is your friend. Be prepared to expect to fail in the majority of your experiments. Experiments aren't a way of proving how right you are. They're a way of finding the best path to a good outcome. And as a somewhat trivial example, think of, if you can, the name of any artist. Let's say specifically musical artist. If anyone can name a musical artist who, having never written a song before in their life, wrote their first song and it went to #1. For those of you old enough to remember the hit parade, Top of the Pops, right? I can pretty much guarantee you there is nobody in the history of the writing of music who has ever, on their first attempt at writing a song, written something successful enough to be sold to millions of people. And that sounds like a triviality. It sounds like a truism. Well, of course that's not the case. Well, if you don't expect it of musicians, why do you expect the same thing of businesses? Why do you expect that on your first attempt you are just going to automatically get things right by magic? Because you're not. Just like the songwriter who had to write 10,000 songs before they hit on a way of doing it that people liked. So you're going to have to try, well, hopefully not 10,000, but maybe 10 or 50 or 100 different things in the process of working your way along that path towards a successful outcome. So from our value proposition, we have a set of assumptions, I would hope, things that you've written down on Post-it notes, things that say, in order for my business to succeed, this thing needs to be the case. So the next task with those Post-it notes is to prioritize them. And we do that with something like the graph that's on the left here. So the vertical axis here is defined as the magnitude of impact. We go from low to high. And what that means is a high impact, in this case, is a negative effect on your business. So the higher the impact of that assumption being incorrect, the worse it is for your business, and the higher up the y-axis it goes. So we can now define two areas, top and bottom. So the bottom is low impact. So in other words, if your assumption is incorrect, it doesn't have that bad an effect on your business. The top half is high impact. If your assumption is incorrect, it has a really bad effect on your business. The next thing is a notion of how long it will be before that impact may be felt. So on the horizontal axis, we've got a time to impact. This is a time scale. It's reversed compared to most time scales. So on the left-hand side, we've got in the future, and on the right-hand side, we've got now. That's just a little conceit because we want the top right quadrant to be the most important one. Okay, so in addition to our low and high impact bottom and top areas, we've now introduced a when is it likely to occur? Left and right, future and now. So we've got 4 quadrants. Top right is a high impact, so a really bad effect on your business. And if it turns out your assumption is wrong, it's going to happen now. So top left is a high negative impact on your business if the assumption is wrong, but it's going to happen in the future. Bottom right is a low impact on your business that will happen now, and bottom left, a low impact that will happen in the future. And hopefully you can see that the ones that are most important are the top right quadrant. In other words, those things, those assumptions, that if they turn out to be incorrect, are going to have a bad effect on your business right now. And we take those assumptions and we turn them into our hypothesis. So a hypothesis is a way of expressing an assumption in a way that is testable. In other words, it can be shown by the outcome that the hypothesis is true or false based on evidence. It is discrete. It describes only one distinct testable thing to be investigated, and it's precise. You know what success looks like. And most importantly of all, you define what success is before you run the experiment that is based on this hypothesis. And the hypotheses we're creating, remember, relates to these 3 areas that we derive from the innovation equation. So the feasibility, can we do this? Desirability is the first point. do they want this? Followed by feasibility, can we do this? Followed by viability, should we do this? Now, if you've read the Lean Startup, you've probably come across an idea called the build, measure, learn cycle. This is another place where I take issue with the terminology, and I think it's really important to be careful with the terminology. Now, Eric Ries, who wrote the Lean Startup, was very precise in his wording, his description of what the build, measure, learn cycle is. So in other words, the build, measure, learn cycle is a way of conducting an experiment in such a way that you get useful data back that you can take action on. But the problem is he called it build, measure, learn. And it puts the word build at the beginning. For me, that's a problem, because most of us are used to this concept of building for the sake of building. And what I'm suggesting is that you need to erase that concept from your head and replace it with the concept of building for the sake of learning. So I prefer to refer to a test cycle. It's not quite as snappy as build, measure, learn, but it goes create, hypothesis, experiment, learn. And there is a formal way of doing this. And again, this is more work, but I really do recommend that you go through this process. So you create a test card. And the test card says, we believe that, and then a description of the hypothesis that you're testing. In order to verify that, we will do the thing that you're about to do as your experiment. We will measure something, and we are right if that thing equals this, or is greater than this, or is less than this, right? And we have a measure of criticality, so we're starting off with the most critical things, but also, significantly, we have a measure of data reliability, and it's important to recognize that some of the results you get may not be entirely reliable. It doesn't mean that they're not useful results, you just need to recognize that and be aware of it. And in conducting your experiment, once it's run, you can create a learning card that says, we believe that this thing is the case. We observed that something happened. From this we learned, and therefore we will take action. Now, I've referred to experiments throughout this. You can call them experiments, you can call them prototypes. I'm going to be controversial here and beg you not to call them MVPs, or minimum viable products. Please don't use that term. And again, there's a reason why I say that, and it's because use of that term, in my experience, leads to wrong thinking. Why is that the case? Well, let's look at the three words that are involved. Minimum viable product. Start off with minimum. I guarantee you, I bet a large amount of money that what you show me as your minimum viable product will not be minimum. Absolutely guarantee it. Because it is in your nature as a startup founder to think that I want things to be perfect. And the constant refrain is, oh, we just need to do this thing, or I just want that, or we can't release it without this. You forget all of that. Please, please forget it. The sooner you start experimenting, the better. So MVPs are never minimum. The next thing is viable. Well, realistically, you're not the one who gets to choose whether it's viable. So that's kind of pointless. And the final thing is product. Again, this makes you think you're building a product. You don't have to start with a product, and you shouldn't start with a product. Your experiment should be so far away from a product that you can barely see it in the distance, but it's there and it's recognizable in the distance, right? And I'm going to give you some examples. But just a quick note before I show you these examples. Again, controversially, always remember your customers will lie to you. I don't mean that they are nasty people, and I don't mean that they are purposely trying to make your life difficult. It's just human nature. If you say to someone, hello there, I'm starting up a new business creating widgets. Are you interested in my new widget making business? If you've done this, let's say in a coffee shop, you know, the stereotypical way of interviewing people, go to a coffee shop, offer to buy them a coffee in return for answering some questions. If you say that to someone there, there's a very strong chance they're going to say, oh yeah, I'm really interested in that. Because by nature, human beings are generally nice, and they're cooperative, and they are concerned with your feelings, even if they don't recognize it. They don't necessarily want to be rude and say to your face, no, get lost. And even if they're thinking to themselves, no, get lost, they'll probably say yes, because they're thinking to themselves, well, if I just say yes, of course I'll buy this thing. Hopefully this guy or girl will just get lost and I can get on with my day. And there's a book that I highly recommend. If you haven't heard of it already, it's called The Mom Test, M-O-M, because it's written by an American gentleman called Robert Fitzpatrick. And he will explain in that book how you can ask people questions in such a way that even your own mother can't lie to you. Moving on swiftly from that point. Okay, so I said, please start experimenting before you have a product. In fact, when your product is so far away you can barely see it on the horizon. Here are some examples of things that you can do by way of experiment right now that don't cost you much money, but might cost you a bit of effort, but can give you a great many very useful results. First and foremost, interviews. Actually speak to your customers. Speak to the partners and suppliers that are essential in order for your business to survive. Talk to expert stakeholders. Speak to people. Have a conversation. And in that conversation, you can do things like, would you mind if I sat next to you virtually, obviously, at the moment, whilst you were performing your day-to-day business? Because I want to see what it is that you actually do in order that I can properly understand those jobs that I mentioned previously in the value proposition. You can send out a survey to people, but please read the Mom Test first, because otherwise you only get one. Excuse me. That was a hiccup that came out the wrong way. You only get one chance, generally speaking, to ask questions in a survey. So you need to make sure that the questions that you're asking are going to give you meaningful answers and aren't leading people by the nose. However, if you've read the Mom Test, there are ways you can create surveys that will give you an awful lot of useful information. The internet is your friend. Perform search trend analysis. Look up search words. Use Google AdWord keyword tools. And companies like Moz, moz.com, to show you how many people use which keywords every month. Go online, look at Facebook to find groups that are related to the market you're interested in. Go on discussion forums, ask people questions, join meetups, create an online advert as a banner to go in Google or on a web page, create a social media campaign. Another good one, paper prototype. If you're selling a physical product, then make a mock-up out of paper so people can visualize it before you have to actually create it. Create a storyboard that explains to people how you go about what the benefits are of the thing that you're selling. Create a data sheet. Again, this is more a physical product. Create a data sheet or a brochure that explains what your product might look like if it were created, if it were produced. Obviously not telling people it doesn't yet exist, but you can show them this is what it might be like. Create a video that you can share through your social media to explain what it is you're trying to do. If you're creating something which is more technologically based, a clickable prototype. It can be a wireframe. It doesn't have to be high resolution, but high resolution is high fidelity, but high fidelity is good as well. But it's a prototype. It's something that doesn't actually do the thing. It just looks like it does. Create a mashup. A simple landing page is a brilliant place to start. And that landing page can incorporate several of the ideas that are also explained on this page. Create a crowdfunding campaign. I've been speeding up at the end here because I can see I spent 54 minutes and I want to leave a little bit of time for questions. So I have one more slide which I'm going to skip over. Just to say that, ideally, in order to create a successful startup technology-led business, what you do is you start in a very focused way on a small number of people with your skateboard, and you build outwards from there. Having built success, having learned things from building your skateboard, your next iteration is a scooter, followed by a bicycle, followed by a motorcycle, all the way up to the Ferrari that you originally wanted to build. I hope that in this very whistle-stop tour, I've said some things which are of use to you and given you some tools that you can use yourselves to set yourself on the right path. If there's one thing that I could ask you to take away from all of this, it is simply start with the problem. And I'm going to end the show there and hope that we've got a few minutes left for anyone to ask questions who would like to ask questions.
Thanks a lot, Paul. That was, as always, really, really interesting. Some great advice and everything. I was keeping my eye on the stage and the questions within there, and I just thought one came in fairly early in the talk when you were looking at the disturbing stats section.
Oh yes.
It was Jonathan Rains who asked, "Do we have equivalent stats for Geovation companies to compare?" Now, in my intro slide, I mentioned how we've supported 125 companies, and 79% of those are still active. We do have a colleague within Geovation that looks into this in a bit more detail, and each 6 months we create a bit of an impact tracker report. But yeah, I hope that one answers that one for you, Jonathan, unless you've got anything else to add, Paul, to that.
No, simply that, as you say, we're looking at all the measures that we can find at the moment and trying to find better ways continuing to measure all of this moving forward. But unfortunately, we don't. Yeah, it's something that we can and will be doing better to keep a measure of how people succeed. Although, generally speaking, and I probably shouldn't say this, but generally speaking, if you look at the impact that accelerators have, that there isn't a lot of evidence, at least countrywide, that accelerators make a big difference. All I can say to you is, my personal experience is that talking to and working with startups, they tell me that they get good things out of it. Anecdotally, that's the best I can do at the moment, but I can't provide any concrete evidence for that, unfortunately, but hopefully we will do.
Thanks, Paul. Another question came in from Regan, and it was around, how does the value proposition canvas fit into frameworks like the business model canvas? Does that cover execution?
So that's a very good question. It covers execution to an extent. So in the same way that the customer persona is a starting point for the value proposition, so the value proposition is a starting point for the business model canvas. So there's not much point in getting to the business model canvas, which starts looking at things like revenue and partnerships and ways of achieving execution. There isn't much point moving on to execution until you've established, first of all, that a problem exists that people are prepared to pay for, and secondly, that you can provide a solution to at least part of that problem. But once you've established that, yes, absolutely, it forms the basis of 2 or 3 of those cells of the business model canvas, depending upon which business model canvas you use, because obviously there are a number of them. But it very much feeds into that, because it will inform who you need as partners, where the criticalities are in the actual execution of your business.
Thanks, Paul. And that's actually it in terms of questions that came in on the chat. So just once again, thanks to Paul for a great talk. Thank you to the Bristol Technology Festival team for having us today. And please do get in touch with us if you have any questions after the event. I'm just going to pop a link in the chat there now as well, just through to our how you can join Geovation as a community member. It's free to do so. There are no hooks. You'll receive a newsletter from us to be able to join our community forum, etc. So that's it. We hope you enjoyed the talk. And once again, last minute plug for tomorrow. We have another session running at 11 a.m. Around the Ordnance Survey Data Hub, that portal that I mentioned earlier in the talk. So please do join us for that one if that's of interest. Okay, thank you very much all. Take care and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.